I'll tell you a little bit about her. So Dr. Megan O'Reilly is an adjunct faculty member in the Stanford School of Medicine and a staff psychologist at Stanford University's Counseling and Psychological Services, where she currently serves as a program coordinator for outreach, equity, and inclusion. Dr. O'Reilly created the first satellite clinic for Black undergraduate and graduate students across the African diaspora, increasing access for Black students to receive immediate and ongoing counseling care. Dr. O'Reilly is the co-founder and CEO of Inherent Value Psychology Incorporated. Her private practice in downtown Palo Alto, California, provides DEI consulting, international speaking engagements, as well as group and individual clinical services for BIPOC Silicon Valley professionals. The mission of Inherent Value Psychology is to redefine productivity as liberating the unconditional self. Yes. As a mental health consultant for the United Negro College Fund's STEM Scholar Program, Dr. O'Reilly supports Black college students in navigating the emotional stressors of underrepresentation and discrimination in STEM fields. She also serves as the lead clinician in a partnership with Google to provide group therapeutic spaces called the Gathering Space for Black Google employees in response to the murder of George Floyd and the chronic trauma, grief, and loss in the Black community. Dr. O'Reilly took to the TEDx stage in 2018 to remind us that our lives matter to the world. Her TEDx talk, Enough is Enough, the power of your inherent value, can be seen on YouTube. So without further introduction after that, here is Dr. Megan O'Reilly to deliver our keynote presentation. Thanks so much, Dr. O'Reilly.
Thank you very much for that gracious intro. It's always nice to hear your mission and value spoken back to you.
Yes.
Happy to be here with all of us. So students, staff, faculty, and alumni, it is an honor to be here. It is also a somber duty to address all of you today. It's an honor because my heart resides in Texas. As a proud Texan and a Baylor graduate, I leapt at the chance to have this opportunity to pay homage to each of you and to the UTD community. Our presence at this summit commemorates the fact that we are all still here. It is not lost on me that at this time last year was the beginning of the unequivocal end of life as we knew it. It was March in the Bay Area where we received the official stay-at-home order from the state. And I learned that for Texans, this occurred on March 17th. In the psychology of grief work, this is called an anniversary effect. Yes, not all anniversaries are joyous. Some are sorrows. Sorrows that are relived and made more poignant again at the time or season that the original loss or trauma occurred. This means that you, me, the entire UTD community, the nation, and the world is collectively reverberating in a communal mourning. A mourning that is due to COVID-19 becoming a global pandemic that ensnared us all. Many of us here have lost someone. The Pew Research Center tells us that 4 in 10 Americans know someone who has been hospitalized or died from COVID. And so I extend to you strength, peace, and cherishing of memories as you continue to navigate life without your loved ones. I'm sorry for their loss. And my first invitation to you is to acknowledge this truth of this grief and grant yourself the grace to feel off and unproductive. Now let's remain in this practice of truth-telling and turn our attention to another pandemic, also that ensnared us all, just as deadly and equally global. I'm speaking of the pandemic of white supremacy and all of its manifestations of xenophobia, racism, sexism, classism. It's a very powerful ideological strain that mutates and manifests differently across time and location. And this time last year, we were all captive in our homes and confined to bear witness to the dismissed realities of what it means to be Black in this country, to be brown in this country, to be indigenous, immigrant, international, female in this country, and poor in this country. Many of us in this Zoom room watched and were deeply traumatized as Black people were murdered while running, murdered while shopping, murdered while in their bed sleeping. The global outrage and protest that follows perhaps meant that everyone else could finally see the injustice too, that maybe this time the veil that W.E.B. Du Bois spoke about was being pulled back to reveal the double consciousness of belonging to a targeted group, that this could become a shared consciousness toward real liberation. Yet, solidarity is complicated because it underscores the apathy and silence of all the years prior. All this has brought told and untold impacts to our mental health and well-being that we will illuminate today together. We will shine a light on how it was that we woke up and still attended classes and work, took care of children and siblings and family members, all while hurting and enraged. We'll spotlight the cognitive energies we expended to be professional and productive in the midst of this. We'll also shine a light on our hope and resilience to build the world we deserve to live in. Now, hope is hard because I believe there is a dual nature to many things in life. As a psychologist who has held hundreds of human stories, one of the most consistent pairings I've witnessed is the coexistence of crisis and opportunity. It is often how we respond to an event that makes it what it becomes, either crisis or opportunity. And we've gathered together now for the opportunity to look back over this crisis. Not to ruminate on a year that many of us would like to forget, but to instead to behold and be emboldened by who we are becoming and who we are still aiming to be. All of this pain also brought perspective, another unwanted yet daunting pairing in life. We now have a perspective about how bad things can get, how we respond to hardship, and what type of structures we must build to sustain a new way forward. I believe that an informed future demands a recognition of the past. So let us begin. January 2020. Many of us rang in the new year with anticipation, perhaps in large crowds that is only a faint memory to us now. And like most years, this was a year many of us vowed to get our lives together, maybe academically, socially, in our careers, perhaps with our physical health. So many dreams deferred. I remember listening to the news on what used to be my commute to work, and I remember first learning about a place called Wuhan and a flu-like sickness. If I'm being honest, I failed to recognize myself as a global citizen before all this. I failed to recognize that one of the largest human migrations happens every year at Lunar New Year, with celebrations that can span from January to March. For example, in 2019, 415 billion of our fellow international students, staff, faculty, and friends and colleagues and their partners of Asian descent traveled home for a cultural staple that was deeply missed this year. So to all that celebrate Lunar New Year, we see you. January also held unprecedented fires in Australia, the tragic death of Kobe Bryant and his daughter Gianna, and the US airstrikes in Iran and the death of Qasem Soleimani. So to everyone of Australian or Iranian descent, and to everyone impacted by military tensions, and to those of us who Kobe's life lived and represented, everything that his life represented gave us life, we see you. February 2020. In February was the first American death of COVID. We started tracking it then. There were also 4 shootings across the nation, and Harvey Weinstein was convicted of rape and sexual assault. And on February 23rd, 25-year-old Ahmaud Arbery was pursued and shot while jogging. To the survivors of sexual assault, we see you, and to all the Black men, we see you. March 2020. In March, there was airstrikes in Syria to Turkey, which killed 33. The Winter Olympics were postponed. And on March 13th, Breonna Taylor was murdered in her home. This is precisely why the UTD Black student body, in a letter to the president under the section Campus-Wide Cultural Competency and Diversity Training, called for a diversified UTD police force. So to all the Black women, we see you. Then there was April of 2020. And as far as I can recollect, April was a quiet month. I know I had a quarantine birthday and everyone else was getting obsessed with Tiger King. So there was a little levity in April. May 2020. May marked the arrival of murder hornets. Do you remember this? To North America. This is the giant hornets that pose a real threat to bees and entire bee colonies. And I remember many jokes being cracked about murder hornets, maybe because of the name. But I point this out because many of us don't know how essential bees are to our agricultural ecosystem. Maybe there's a scholar in here today who could speak to it. But some countries are already forced to hand pollinate their crops. And this is no laughing matter because you can imagine who are the people doing this type of labor, right? And also in May, time stood still on May 25th for 8 minutes and 15 seconds while George Floyd was murdered under the knee of dehumanization. Again and always, Black men, we see you. In August of 2020, there was an explosion in Beirut. Tons of ammonium killed 190 people and injured thousands. We lost our Black Panther, Chadwick Boseman, to cancer. And here in California, the skies turned orange due to many fires in different locations. It was very eerie, but also very fitting for the year. In September of 2020, we had to hold the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And many of us were gripped by fear of what this meant for the makeup of the Supreme Court. So to all the feminists in the room, of all genders, we see you. Then October, November, and December of 2020, what we normally call the holiday season, was not festive for most due to not being able to travel to family, a contentious political cycle, anxiety-provoking presidential debates, and a transfer of power that was delayed confirmation. And to boot, we lost an intellectual icon, Alex Trebek. Now allow me to continue because in the short first quarter of 2021, we've had an insurrection at the Capitol, an unprecedented winter freeze that each of you have endured, that once again put the inequities of race and class on full display. And just in the last 2 weeks, I've had to update my address to include the hate crimes towards Asian women in Atlanta, because that's what they were, hate crimes, even if the media is not naming it, and the shooting in Boulder, Colorado. So to our Asian American and Pacific Islander community, we see you. So here it all is, and now we're holding it together. To be seen in our struggles is a validating experience, and I sincerely hope you see yourself as well. Walking through each month, I intend to honor what you've survived. So let us anonymously check in now. What was the hardest month for you last year? There's a multitude of experiences in this room and a collective UTD experience. So let's look together. I want to put this link in the chat, which will allow us to have a little bit of a conversation.
Dr. O'Reilly, I think you're muted. Your mic is off.
Go ahead and check out this link. Thank you. And we will look on together. Okay, let me present. I'm getting some results in. Okay. It's fluctuating, but coming in with the highest score so far is April, May, and June. Oh, October, November, December is creeping up. not surprised to see that January and February is the lowest. We had somewhat of a normal January, February before this all hit in March. October is taking the lead, the last quarter of the year. Thank you. Okay. Thank you for sharing those experiences with me, because I believe that understanding can spark compassion. We have to understand that last year and this year has been traumatizing. Then and only then can we compassionately attend to ourselves. This may sound like a no-brainer, but many of you as students are not being as compassionate with yourself as you could be. Let me take you behind the scenes into some of the psychology of high achievers like yourself. Now, faculty and staff, this goes for you as well. But in the early stages of the pandemic, what I was seeing in counseling is that people would tell me that they're going to work from home and use this opportunity to be more productive and get ahead on projects. And just yesterday, I had an Asian American graduate student wonder out loud in session if he was using the events in Atlanta as an excuse not to write his dissertation. Not the case, right? He was deeply impacted. So you may wince at these stories, but what's your story? Silently check in. Have you been treating yourself like a robot of production given this context? Have you been setting realistic standards for yourself? Because you're against the backdrop of trauma. Okay. So I know the word trauma gets used a great deal on college campuses, sometimes correctly, sometimes incorrectly. So let's get on the same page. Trauma, general trauma, is any event that is disturbing and distressing. It can be a one-time event or a series of events. It can be directly experienced or vicariously learned about and experienced that causes overwhelming amounts of stress and deregulation that exceeds someone's ability to cope or integrate the emotions involved. Okay? This obviously leads to long-term serious negative consequences. Now, racial trauma, which we can also call race-based traumatic stress, refers to the emotional pain that is either the direct or vicarious experience of racism and discrimination to members of a shared community. And then there's intergenerational trauma, which is that phenomena passed down through time and generation. And this is an important place to pause, because what happens to one of us is felt by all of us. We see our brothers, sisters, friends, daughters, ourselves synonymously with the lives that are lost. When we are in this place, we are highly likely to feel all or any of the following experiences, which includes increased vigilance, suspicion, substance abuse, cognitive cloudiness, even psychophysiological impacts like high blood pressure, irregular sleep, emotional things like tearfulness, anger. All of this is not advantageous for downloading information, which is your primary role as a student, or presenting and communicating information as a faculty member. So the emotional numbness, the depression, and the neuroscience of this is that we're in our emotional midbrain, our fight or flight reflexive midbrain, right? So this is another invitation for you to grant yourself grace if you have not been hacking it or producing like you used to. Many students are taking a leave of absence. Many of our international students can't travel home for fear of not being able to come back. Many of us have experienced canceled internships and diminished jobs prospects. Okay? And once again, those of us with less economic means have the digital divide to deal with as well, playing a role in how all these stressors are navigated. So let's share together in the room again. I want us to see what of these physiological and emotional impacts we might be feeling as a collective. Here's that link again, and I'll share my screen. First question. Have you been setting realistic standards for yourself given the traumatic context? Yes, no, sometimes. Let's watch this for a moment. Sometimes, okay. All right, getting a little close, neck and neck with no and sometimes. For those of us voting sometimes, it would be very interesting to see what domains you're giving yourself grace and what domains you're not, and why that there's a no domain that's a little bit more rigid. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, let's look at the next slide together. This is a slide where you get to rank order the physical trauma symptoms you may be experiencing. Is it interrupted sleep, which can look like difficulty falling asleep because you're amped up, or waking up prematurely? I've even actually heard of something called revenge insomnia. It's from social media, so don't take it as a peer-reviewed term. But that is when you stay up late because you haven't had any time to yourself. So you take it out of the wee hours. Okay. I'm seeing physical exhaustion in the lead. Mm-hmm. I also want to take a moment to talk about appetite. A lot of times when we're anxious, it decreases our appetite. However, for communities of color, we actually see an increase in appetite, usually in those salty, savory foods that give us that nice dopamine hit and a little bit of an escape. Okay. Okay. Interrupted sleep now is in the front. Mm-hmm. Another manifestation of trauma is having intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, nightmares. There's a virility of bad news and disturbing images. And so one self-care technique that we can just name right here is being able to step away from the news. I know a lot of us like to be informed and even feel like it's a privilege to be informed. However, we need to pair that with self-preservation. One technique is to pick one day a week where you listen to the recap of all the news instead of being inundated by it each day. Okay. Let's look at the emotional symptoms. And as you're voting, let me speak to numbness. Numbness isn't apathy. I've had so many BIPOC students ask me, I can't feel anything anymore. It's like I don't care. How could that be? Numbness is actually the overwhelm of feelings, not the absence of it. Think of your body as an antennae that kind of the light bulb finally got blown because it was overcharged, right? And so numbness, I like to think of it as one of the body's last defense mechanisms. If I just can't feel anything, I can preserve myself. So numbness was in the lead. Hypervigilance, anxiety, rumination, depression, and hopelessness is number one right now for our group. Okay. Thank you for participating. Oh, hypervigilance. I imagine these will continue to ebb and flow. So thank you for that vulnerability and that sharing with each other and together. And as you were sharing, it brings me to a profound question that we each get to answer today. Because the skills that we use to survive are not the same skills we need to thrive. So here's the question. What if we kept sharing the truth of who we are with each other? And that might sound a little vague, so let me flesh it out for you. One of the things I experienced, enjoyed, and even began to embrace during the pandemic was how the facade started to come down, how the pretense had to fall away. So everything from simple things like my cat jumping up in the middle of a therapy call or my baby screaming in the background while I was giving class lectures, all the way up to my manager encouraging me to take the day off, the day when the Breonna Taylor's murderers were not charged. This means he saw me in my fullness as a Black woman, not just as an employee with work to do and produce that day. I can tell you that this was not the case in previous years. I can recall crying at my desk, watching cell phone footage of Walter Scott's murder. If we recall, that is the one where he was shot in the back and a gun was planted on him. I had to quickly wipe away these tears and attend a meeting, right? So I believe something has changed. So intersectionality recognizes that identity markers do not exist independently of each other. This was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, phenomenal work. That each identity informs the other, often creating complex convergence of oppression. That is when it's applied to people and social identities. Yet, what is it to be said about a particular cultural zeitgeist in which there is an extraordinary convergence of shared humanity brought by COVID-19 and then centered humanity, watching what's occurring to BIPOC lives? So my call to each of this evening is that when COVID finally is more managed, that we do not return to seeing each other as a means to an end. And instead, we begin to truly embrace our interdependence and cognitively and behaviorally walk out in that. And so as a cognitive behavioral therapist, I like to get concrete. What could this look like? What does the rubber meet the road? Well, I'll actually start with staff because I think staff and faculty get to set some of these cultures, and then I'll talk about students. So what does it mean to keep sharing the truth and fullness of who we are? Well, as staff and faculty, I invite you to include in your syllabus maybe an anti-hate statement, something that is uniquely crafted and genuinely crafted from your heart. This signals to students that you are aware and able to have these conversations, that you're willing to cultivate a classroom into being a safer space. There are no 100% safe space, but safer, right? In addition, what is your national event policy protocol? It's unfortunate, but there will be more hate crimes and shootings and loss of life. I can't tell you how many countless times in counseling students have told me that they feel unseen and dismissed when their professor says nothing about a large-scale event that impacted their community. I recently had one student, again, a graduate student, that said, I feel like I'm living in an alternate universe where outside of the lab, I'm dealing with all this, but inside the lab, it's like a bubble where none of those things penetrate or seen. So I know the news is triggering to you as well, and you may need to step away, but when you learn of something, whenever that is, acknowledge it, right? Be familiar with your counseling center and the wonderful people that work there so you can make referrals. I would say go as far as to meet one or two of the staff so you have a person-to-person connection when you're talking to students. It doesn't have to be your domain to counsel and hold students, but you are squarely in the domain of attending to their whole personhood, not just their minds, because there is no health without mental health. Lastly, I would say to faculty and staff to get a DEI buddy. DEI is diversity, equity, inclusion. A DEI buddy could be someone you can process diversity, equity, inclusion themes with. Question your ideas, run things by them. This work takes a village, so you may need to create one for yourself. Do not wait for the next mandatory training. Find a colleague, maybe with one salient identity different from yours, than your constellation of identities, and form a respectful learning space of mutual growth. Someone who you could go and say, hey, I've made this comment in class today. How does that land? How could it land for different people? Or I'm thinking about rolling out this new process. Can you check it for any bias or blind spots? How often have we had that conversation, right? This is what cultural humility and action requires, right? It requires being on the lookout for dismantling forces of all the isms, right? And in the words of Ibram Kendi, it's not enough to be just not racist. We must be anti-racist, which is an active, always scanning for inequalities that are inherent in some of our existing systems. And for students, your work actually begins within you, knowing when to walk in your truth and when you're reaching capacity. Please know that you can be a boss and a trailblazer and still have an upper limit. We can hold both of those truths. One thing I do with all my student clients is help them identify what I call the precursors to distress. What are the early emotional, physical, and cognitive signs that you can notice before you're all the way in burnout? Because before you're there, you have more emotional resources to repair and to be resilient. Secondly, know that you're part of this grand experiment, which is the COVID cohort. No one knows yet the lasting implications of what this will be. This is hard for a majority of you because maybe in your life before COVID, input yielded output. You worked hard, you got a result. Well, this time, input does not yield output. You don't get the deserved outcome. It's outside of your locus of control of what's going on in the workforce and the economic sphere. And for BIPOC students, I really want us to step into the words of Audre Lorde, who told us again and again that self-preservation is a radical act, right? We get to push back on mental health stigma. We get to seek help because it's already a need for us. How the world treats us does not signify our worth. And so I think stigma is actually a really efficient way of keeping us stuck, right? So we need to know when to ask for help, and we need to go and get those resources, particularly now while you're on such a phenomenal campus, while these resources are available to you. And lastly, don't go it alone. If you're an activist, which looks many different ways, I want you to lean on others in the community. I actually like to liken activism as a choir. Everyone has different parts, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and while you're taking a breath, which is needed, someone else is sustaining the note. And while you're sustaining the note, they're taking a breath, right? So together we can make this more sustainable for each of us. Now, no one knows what the continued joys and sorrows will be with the rest of this year, what will be presented for us to endure. But we do know who we are becoming. We are becoming unapologetic in our demands for justice. We are becoming more compassionate and standing in solidarity with each other. And we're becoming more deeply connected as humans. This is the way that we move beyond forward together. So I thank you for listening to me and listening to each other. And I have one final Mentimeter as we move into the Q&A portion. And that is just sounding off. Who are you becoming in all this hardship? And what might you need to build these structures we're talking about? So let me drop that into the chat now. And I thank you for your attention. Okay, let's go ahead and sound off on this. And Elena, I'm open to Q&A at this time as well.
I'm open to it too. That was beautiful. I had to take a couple breaths there after just to let it soak in. So thank you so much. Yes, people, it looks like people are dropping in their responses. So I agree with Dr. O'Reilly. Let's open it up. I think we can weave in these responses, and then if anyone has any questions, reflections, I'll kind of monitor the chat, and I'll monitor if anyone raises their hand, and then I guess I'll call on you just so we don't have all these questions rushing in at once. So however folks would like to engage, now is the time. And thank you so much, Dr. O'Reilly.
No problem. My joy. And I'm loving what I'm seeing coming in. I just want to highlight a few. Someone says not to hold it in, to let it out. That is a beautiful takeaway. Some of us are internalizers, some of us are externalizers, but it's very important to discharge some of this weight. Someone else said, I don't give myself enough credit. Well, start today. You can get to do one of these. So dust your shoulder off. finding my joy through music. We should talk more about joy. Mm-hmm. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Mm-hmm.
Giving ourselves grace, I think that's a big one that I've been talking myself through, and also talking with clients and other colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely a daily practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Working to improve empathy is very valuable in appreciating others and even yourself. Yeah, empathy is not complete unless it includes you. That's what I like to say. Mm. Yeah. I also like to talk about this. Someone says, prioritizing your own mental health is essential. I've sacrificed so much of my own mental health and emotional well-being chasing prestige and status. If I may, just for a moment on that note, I like to say it's not about if you'll get there, it's about how you treat yourself on the way. And I like walking people through this little Venn diagram. Do I have my dry erase board in here? I do not. But it's one circle is your values, which is a lovely process of exploring and identifying. And the other circle is validation. And so when something comes across your desk or an opportunity comes your way, it's a nice time to pause and think, am I doing this because it's stemming from my values, what I want to do in life, how it fulfills me, my mission and passion, purpose, or am I doing it because it's shiny to the world and it's going to give me some validation? This one's fleeting and this one's enduring. And since it's a Venn diagram, there's some space in the middle, and that's okay to find yourself there. But if you're constantly catching yourself off on this validation only side, that's going to create, at least in my view, a ceaseless striving that isn't going to be as fulfilling. So we want to find the things that have us landing in the values. And if the world likes it too, so be it. But you have to like it first. It has to mean something to you. So to whoever shared that, I wish you luck on that pursuit. We're all in it. Mm-hmm.
Yes, so true. I love that about values. I think about that and talk with clients about that all the time, and I think it really serves as, just kind of a reframe for people, and they're like, yeah, that can be my compass, and that'll kind of guide me through some of these really, really difficult, painful times. So
Compass is